Good afternoon, everyone. So yes, I'm from DSTL. Hopefully you may have heard of us before, but if not, we're the Ministry of Defence's in-house science and technology centre of expertise. And as has already been said, this is some work that's been done with the University of Southampton. And a disclaimer that I'm obliged to say that this is some research work, so please don't infer from this any past, future, or current MOD policy or anything else like that. So, moving on. So, Internet of Things security. I'm pretty sure I don't need to talk to an audience such as this about the fact that security in the IoT is a problem and it's a big deal. And I think we'll take that as a given. But I think one of the things that is important to note is that actually we kind of require our developers of end products to have some expertise in security. And actually security is hard. And if you're a security professional, or if you're somebody that thinks about security, spends a lot of time in that space, there are implicit assumptions about how things are supposed to work that you have that you probably don't even know that you have. And then a normal, quote-unquote, developer, particularly somebody that's thinking about it from a product point of view, simply may not have a lot of these. Security professionals need to be better at trying to communicate and help the end users, so the end user developers don't have to be experts themselves. And that's really at the heart of what this work is looking to do. The threat, I think, is again very well understood. We talked to the previous speaker, mentioned a number of these. Obviously, things like interception of sensitive data, potentially also spoofing and modifying data. In the case of vehicles and things like that, can be quite significant. But there's also a number of other threats. Threats to the device itself. Maybe you're trying to destroy a device or cause a denial of service attack. Maybe you're trying to co-opt that, cause a botnet. We talked about Mirai and various other things in that type. And of course also don't forget the risk that your device potentially can be a gateway onto the network that it sits on and a way into that as an attack vector. So if that's the threat, what is it that we're specifically focused on? So I should say that this work we're looking at has very much come from the point of view of this what we call a C2, command and control oriented kind of approach. Firstly, we're a military organisation, so it fits very nicely with that military mindset of there being somebody in charge and a number of subordinates underneath them. But of course, it also reflects the way a lot of real-world devices actually work as well. And if you think about a number of products where actually you interface with a web service that then talks to your product rather than communicating with it directly. So actually that kind of approach is actually fairly widespread. And there are lots of examples of those. So, that said, what is it we're trying to do? Well, really what we're looking at here is trying to take the idea of commodity components, commodity protocols, and build with them, or at least to show that it's possible to build, using those, a kind of a turnkey solution for IoT security. University of Southampton has done lots of work in the past looking at building commodity servers and things like that into HPC hardware. One of my co-authors for this, Professor Simon Cox, was one of the first people to bundle together a whole load of Raspberry Pis to make a cluster of those. Again, proof of concept as something that you could do. So we're very used to that in hardware, and increasingly within software, we're also seeing exactly the same thing. If you are developing in any of those languages there, and probably all manner of others as well, really what you're doing is not so much writing your own code, you're gluing together a bunch of other people's functions. And that's kind of the ecosystem, and that leads for very rapid application development, which is great. And it means that if you have a secure tool in that space, you can potentially then get the benefit from that without necessarily being the expert yourself. Obviously, that has some dangers as well. If you have a breach in a commonly used tool, then obviously there's a risk that could be a very widespread compromise. So what we're trying to do is, can we build, really, that's the question, can we build something using off-the-shelf protocols, the sorts of things that people are using to put together an easy-to-use protocol for a secure IoT communication. So I'm going to talk about three areas of this, really. First of all is the protocol that we've looked at, then a little bit of discussion about key management, and then lastly, something about device identities. So we'll start with the protocol. And really our goal here was to look at what is already being widely used. An MQTT is a protocol originally produced by IBM some number of years ago, very, very widely used. It's a publish and subscribe protocol. It's kind of well optimized for slightly less than perfect network conditions. There's a number of qualities of service that you can apply to it, so you can make sure that messages are delivered and all this sort of stuff. But in and of itself, it just defines that there is a thing called a message, which gets sent to a thing called a topic, and what that message is, how you use that is entirely up to you as the application developer or the system developer. So what we've really done is we've taken that concept of an MQTT message, which exists, and then say, okay, well, in that message, let's define our own schema, essentially, for what that data might look like. So we're saying, okay, well, there's a message type, there's a message protocol version, as you'd imagine, all the sorts of things you'd expect. Note also here things like sequence IDs and sender IDs. This is really, really important when you start to think about the way that this protocol could potentially be targeted. One of the things that's really worth thinking about is things like replay attacks, of course. If you have a sequence ID, you have at least some mitigation against that kind of an attack. And perhaps most importantly of all of the data, the whole of that message is then signed by the sender such that the receiver has confidence that not only has the message come from a valid originator, but also that that data hasn't been compromised, corrupted, tampered with, etc. During the transmission. And as soon as we start talking about signatures and cryptography, you may immediately start to wonder, well, hang on a minute, what about the future? We're saying this is great now. What about if we assume that Google have, just announced the last couple of weeks that they were working on this quantum computer that's, now getting to the point where it can actually start to do useful things? What about if somebody announces tomorrow that they've suddenly been able to factor RSA using Shor's algorithm in a quantum computer? Well, that would be pretty bad for the whole of the internet, but it's also going to be obviously very bad for any kind of system that is directly using any of those algorithms that might be compromised. So from the outset, this work has been built around the fact that an implementation has been put together which uses RSA and uses SHA-256, but actually you could just as easily take those and replace them with some cunning new lattice-based cryptography that's completely quantum safe. And as soon as NIST standardize that, which I think is due to happen in the next 4 or 5 years, hopefully this side of somebody inventing a quantum computer that's capable of breaking RSA, otherwise we're all in trouble. But as soon as that happens, you can very easily simply pick this up and say, okay, fine, we're going to recompile this, we're going to redesign the specific implementation of this that we're using, such we're using a different cryptography. And if the end user is using this in the form of a library, as we would imagine that they would, actually, provided that all of the other parties in the communication they are making are all on the same version of the protocol or are all using the same encryption and the same signature algorithms and everything else, actually they don't have to care, and the person that's implementing a system using this really doesn't have to care the fact that, well, this one's using RSA or this one's using something else. Provided everyone's on the same system, the implementation details of that are taken away from somebody who's trying to design a system or trying to design a product. When we think about security, we tend to think about CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But of course, availability isn't necessarily a meaningful concept in the Internet of Things. We may not be able to have availability if we've got devices that are in areas of poor network connectivity. They simply may not be online all the time. You may, for very good reasons, have a device that chooses not to be online for most of the time. Now, it might be because of battery reasons or some kind of emissions control or any other kind of reason you might think of, but periodically you might have a device that it just simply intends to shut off, and actually it's going to turn on once every 12 hours and do some message exchange, see what's going on, and go back to sleep again. So actually availability isn't necessarily relevant. Strictly speaking, confidentiality and encryption isn't necessarily always necessary. Now, the vast majority of any real-world applications would want that, but of course, you may, for whatever reason, choose not to do that. So again, in terms of thinking of this in terms of a modular solution, MQTT is not an encrypted protocol. However, you can choose to encrypt it using TLS, and all the proof of concept work that we've been doing has been doing that. But for a given system, you could just as easily say, well, actually, I'm sending the data, my data is to do with a river height or something like that. Well, do I need to encrypt that? Well, potentially you don't, provided the message is signed, so it can't be tampered with, so you know that it's come from a valid place. You may say, I don't want that overhead. It seems unlikely, but it's an option, and that's availability. Available there. Excuse me. So really, the three things that were most important in terms of IoT security, I would argue, are authenticity, so making sure your message really has come from somewhere you think it should have done, making sure that it has integrity of that message, so that you haven't had a corruption or hasn't been tampered with en route, and then also confidentiality. And briefly, and again, I won't go into too much detail on this, just in point of time, but you can absolutely encrypt MQTT with TLS. However, you do need to think about how you do that. A naive implementation of that doesn't actually buy you any security at all, because unless you can control who can connect to your broker, all it does is deliver them an encrypted feed of your data, which isn't obviously at all useful. And given the way that we have chosen to do key exchange, and I'll come on to this in a moment, actually anyone can rock up and say, hi, I'd like an identity here, which of course immediately opens up the possibility of, well, okay, anyone can intercept any data that's being sent. So what we've actually done to resolve that is to make use of access control within MQTT. Now again, this is not particularly original. This is not particularly clever. This is a functionality that is there in the vast majority of brokers. It's defined in the standards. But it's a bit of a pain to implement. And I think this is one of the things with all of this work, is we've taken things that are perfectly doable, but require you to think about it, require you to take some effort to do it, and kind of do all of that for you and give you something that just works and just does that security. So in this particular case, topic access to an MQTT topic is very much restricted, so that only a device that has a certificate that is containing its identity is able to access that topic pertaining to information concerned with that device. Next we come on to identity, and again, the traditional approach here is, and there's lots and lots of work about this, is in terms of, well, we're going to fix the identity of our device. We're going to manufacture something, we're going to bake into it an absolute perfect, or as perfect as we can security, and so this is the once and only identity of this device. This is great. You can use all sorts of techniques around that. You can do things like secure boot if you've got some keys baked onto your device. And that's great. But it's really expensive, because if you're going to do that, obviously you need a manufacturing process that lets you put those keys onto the device, or you have to buy a module that has those keys baked into them. And also, if you have key distribution, how do you know that nobody has physically compromised that device in the supply chain and actually pulled off that key? Can you be certain about that? And with increasingly long and often uncertain supply chains, that may be quite a challenge. And the last reason that might be an issue is that actually once that device is permanently assigned an identity, that's not revocable. So if I have a device and that device is something that has value to it, not necessarily the traditional smartphone or smart light bulb or something like that, but if I have like a smart car, it's a pretty high chance that I'm going to want to sell that at some point in the future. So how do I know, or how do you know, when you buy my used car, that I don't have access to that vehicle anymore? And if I've only got one identity to that, how do you know that I don't still have some kind of backdoor into that? The alternative, and what we've been looking at, is dynamic identity, which is to say, well, actually, there is no identity at time of manufacture, and anybody can request an identity via a very simple web service to request a key and say, hi, we'd like an identity. You do a little bit of checking around that to make sure you're avoiding deliberate collisions and all that sort of thing. But essentially, it's a case of, as a device, you rock up to the key service, you say, hi, I'd like a key. We do a bit of key exchange. Everybody's happy. That's great, because it means that if I've got my car and you buy it as a second-hand buyer, you can make sure that that original identity is simply removed, and it doesn't matter if I've still got all of the keys to that original identity, because it simply doesn't exist anymore. But the problem with that is if I have such a device, and I say, well, this device here absolutely, genuinely, 100% is this device that has a certificate number, 1234. How do we know this is the device that it claims to be? And that's where the idea of dynamic identity using a third party to confirm that identity comes in. We've been having a look at a couple of different methods for this. This is still work that's ongoing, so I'm going to talk about the idea of a human observer. We're also looking at a machine-based approach for that as well. So if we have a human, we can simply say, okay, well, the device, we're going to send it an encrypted message that only the holder of that device's identity is able to confirm. So again, using RSA as a public-private key. So we sent a message to the device that has this particular identity, and this physical device is claiming to be that device. Well, we can know that because we can ask that device, we'll tell that device to show me that identity and let me as a human compare the value that the command and control system, the website that I've logged into, is displaying to me versus the device, the value the device is displaying. But looking at 128 bits of data is quite difficult. If you even have a long hexadecimal value, it's a typical way of rendering a sort of value. That's quite difficult for a human, the average human at least, to look at and compare. So we're actually looking at alternative ways of presenting that information. So we have things like pictograms, and we have things like word lists that make it very easy. So you can look at this picture here, and you can go, aha, okay, that's some picture of squares. Look at this one over here. You can very easily see that these two are not the same. And that's kind of the idea of that human-moderated proof. By extension, we're looking at the same kind of ideas for a machine-moderated technique. RFID is obviously one, and things like QR codes, of course, as well. QR codes, of course, are very similar to the kind of pictogram approaches we were looking at last time, but of course this time it's designed to be machine readable rather than human readable, which is what the optimization was last time. And we're also looking at a few other technologies in that space as well. But obviously that is still ongoing research, and if you're interested, then do keep an eye out for this, and it will all be published in due course. And then lastly, for the last moment or two, is the kind of the implication of all of this. So to prove that actually having done all of this stuff, we can then make it easy to use, we took the example of saying, well, let's build this as some Python code. Lots of people like Python, nice, easy-to-use language. Increasingly, people are starting to use it in real-world applications as well. Okay, fantastic. Well, can we actually build something that uses all of the stuff that we've talked about here and makes it incredibly easy for an end user to kind of rock up and go, okay, I'm going to write the minimum amount of code that I need to in order to build a device that is involved in a secure C2 exchange. And we think that we've actually done that in a way that makes it easier to build the device using this protocol and these libraries than it would be to simply implement your own completely unsecured equivalent. So that's something which we're still looking at in terms of taking that further as well. In further work, we're looking to do some kind of experiment next year, although we haven't quite got all the details of that yet. That's definitely something which we're going to be publishing again. So there's lots of publication around this already, and there will certainly be more. If you want to know any more about all of this, there is all of the code is open source, and it's all on GitHub. So if you go to github.com/DSTL/syrup, S-R-U-P, you will find all of the code. There's also links in that page to all of the papers that have been published so far that kind of explain all of this in rather more detail than I've been able to do in the sort of 15 or 20 minutes I've had this afternoon. If you would like to know any more about this, then please do drop me a line. My email address is there. I will be around for the rest of the afternoon as well. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening, and hope it's been interesting. Thank you.